Hey, it's Juliana. I wanted to mention that the episode you're about to hear was recorded back in March, before the coronavirus epidemic. It's our kickoff for Season 2, where Catherine and I give the backstory to K-Pod and talk a little bit about who we are. We have a few more episodes that we recorded before the crisis, which will be rolling out over the next several weeks. After that, we'll be switching to remote interviews. I also wanted to give thanks to our friend, creative director Eddie Lita, who redesigned our new logo for K-Pod. As you'll hear, he's actually the one who reintroduced the two of us after almost 20 years. So thank you so much, Eddie. Okay, here's the episode. Take care, everyone.
Hello, and welcome to K-Pod, the podcast about Korean Americans and arts and culture from Korean American Story. I'm Catherine Hong, a writer and editor.
And I'm Juliana Sohn, a photographer.
It's a new year and a new season, Season 2 of K-Pod, and we thought that we'd kick off the season a different way by actually introducing ourselves, which we never did last season.
We always meant to record an episode where we introduced ourselves.
And some of you might be wondering, who the hell are we? So we thought that we'd ask H.J. Lee, who's the executive director of Korean American Story and the godfather of this podcast, and also the man who's with us at every single recording, to interview us for a change. So here's H.J.
Hi, H.J.
Hi, guys. Well, this is an unusual situation.
Yes. We're recording in HJ's basement in Westchester.
I think it would be really nice for people to get to know you guys a little bit better. So you could do a short intro about how you guys met. I know that when Juliana and I spoke about starting a podcast, first person you mentioned was Catherine.
Yes.
So you could talk about why you did that and how did you guys meet? And let's go from there.
So I got in touch with HJ and I sent him a very simple email that said, have you ever considered doing a podcast? Because I thought he would be the one to do it. He had the background, the resources, but also this is where the organization excels. And he sent back an email that said, yeah, I've been wanting to do a podcast and I think you'd be a great host. I've got a great idea. And I thought, whoa. I thought you were supposed to do it. And I did not think that this was something that I wanted to do on my own. Well, at first I didn't think I could do it at all. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I want a partner in crime. And I know just the right person. And I called Catherine and we had lunch with HJ and we just brainstormed and came up with this idea.
Yeah. Juliana and I listened to a lot of podcasts, but we'd never done one. And we love the idea of interviewing people from the arts, musicians, writers.
Yeah. So Catherine and I have been friends for ages. We first met in 1986 when we were in high school, and we were both attending the summer program at Phillips Exeter Academy.
Like good Korean American children, we were sent there to get a leg up and maybe get into good colleges by our parents. So it was an academic summer session. Juliana and I met, and we proceeded to become pen pals in the old-fashioned sense of we wrote letters to each other because I grew up in Long Island. Juliana grew up in New Jersey. So we wrote physical letters. And one time we convinced Juliana's parents to drive her to my house. And you actually came to visit me.
Okay,
Do you remember that? That was like a long trip.
I don't remember any of this. Are you sure it was me?
Yes. And I have letters from you somewhere. Yeah, we were pen pals and we stayed in touch. We saw each other at least, I think, just one time.
I don't
We hung
remember ever going to Great Neck.
Maybe
Is
it
that
was
crazy?
it might have been that other Korean girl I met. No, I think it was you. You'll have to ask your parents, but I think it was you. Do you remember writing letters?
I do. And I think at some point I may have kept those letters. I'm not sure.
Future episode, we will read those letters.
So what I do remember was that I was miserable during my stay at Exeter. I had a really hard time socially. And then maybe the final week or two of a 6-week program, I realized that the girls in my dorm were really, really nice. And that I always wondered years later, like, what became of you? Because in hindsight, I thought she was really great. And I wished I was better friends with her. And I wish I'd kept in touch. And I think it was, I don't know how many years later, but I was reading an issue of Harper's Bazaar, and you were listed as a contributor. And it had said that it was your final issue and you were leaving.
Wow.
And I thought,
don't
oh my
remember
gosh,
that.
this is like ships passing in the night, because it was like I almost was able to connect with her, because I could have gotten in touch with Harper's Bazaar and asked to speak with you, but you were no longer there.
Gosh, I don't recall that they would have written that about me when I left. But,
Really?
but I did work there. But we should explain that we did connect maybe a few years after that when I was working at W Magazine, and I was hanging out in the art department, and the design director, Eddie Leda, had a photo of a woman on his desk hanging out with her kids. And I recognized the woman as my old friend from Exeter Summer School. And turned out that Juliana Sohn was a photographer who shot for W Magazine and was friends with Eddie. Suddenly we're back in touch, and we both had kids. She was working as a successful photographer, and I was working in fashion magazines. And ever since then, we've really been in touch because we've had kids around the same age.
Yeah.
We're both living in Manhattan. And then about a year ago, we started doing this podcast together.
So you both worked for W around the same time, but you never actually worked together.
No.
We never worked on a story
We never
together.
worked on a single
did we?
story together. I rarely met any photographers when I was there because it's all done very separately. So
Yeah.
even if Juliana had shot a story that I edited, I would have never met her.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all assigned by a separate person.
Yeah, it's actually
We're not really working hand in
Yeah,
hand.
it's very interesting because they don't want. I've been on shoots with editors, and they almost see photographers as competition for time. I remember one of the first shoots I did for W, and it was like one of the first shoots I'd ever done. I was photographing Rebecca Miller, the director, and the writer showed up, and she said, "Oh, well, you know, that you can interview." I can interview first, or you can take pictures. And I was like, well, you can interview. That's fine, you know. And then afterwards, I'll take the pictures. And she hogged all the time. So the like 40 minutes, an hour that Rebecca Miller gave me, I ended up having like 15 minutes to shoot. And when I told the photo editor, they were appalled and furious because the writer wasn't supposed to be there at all. And they just found out where the location was and trying to get more time, elbowed her way in and lied to me. And so there's actually a thing where the photo editors try to keep the writer away from the set. I don't know if you've encountered that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're rarely invited on.
Yeah.
Have you elbowed your way in?
No, I don't do that. I don't like to. I found myself intimidated by a lot of the photographers, or the ones that shoot for Harper's Bazaar, Vogue, and W. They're big shop photographers, and they're like the superstars of the magazine.
Yeah.
You know, so,
And they carry a large ego with them?
Yeah, and so no, the writer's very separate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you actually talk about like what kind of people you photographed or interviewed? Like, who do you usually interview, Catherine?
Oh, well, I started off in fashion magazines. My first magazine job was at Vogue in the features department. So I was an assistant. So mostly I helped produce stories about film directors and novelists, you know, dancers, and all the kinds of people you see in those magazines who aren't technically in fashion. A lot of profiles of people.
And what did you do to, like, what specifically did you do as an assistant? Like, what was your
I
job?
got a lot of cappuccino, and I also bought a lot of cigarettes. Back in those days, you
wow.
could smoke in your office, and my boss smoked a lot of cigarettes.
Oh my God, that makes us sound so old.
Yeah. I would update the Rolodex and with a typewriter, and I would do a lot of research. Whatever he was writing about, I would research that person, which meant a lot of actually sometimes going to the library. very long time ago. There's no internet, no email at that time.
Wow.
But yeah, that's how I started out as an assistant. And then to sort of work your way up the editorial ranks.
So at what point do you actually get to do the interviews?
Oh, I don't think I was really an editor for so many years. I really only started writing in earnest when I got to W Magazine, where everybody was a writer and an editor. They didn't really separate. So I was sort of forced to become a writer.
Do you want to explain what an editor does and what the difference is between an editor and a writer?
The editor is, behind the scenes. So we come up with the ideas for the stories, and we have to keep an eye out on what the news is and what the zeitgeist is and figure out who could write them. Or sometimes there's a great writer that you want to work with and you ask them what they want to write about.
Wow, it's actually quite different than traditional literary definition of an editor.
Yes, magazine editing is like that.
It's the ideas person.
Yeah.
I didn't know that, actually. So at what point did you start interviewing people?
And
who are they?
I always did a few interviews here and there, but I guess at W was where I did actually a bunch of celebrity interviews. One of my favorite ones was Gwyneth Paltrow, who was then making her big comeback. And so she was in Iron Man, and she had a baby who was the same age as my daughter. And I went and I interviewed her in Amagansett, and we had a lot of mommy talk, and she seemed horrified because I wasn't doing anything that she was doing. Her child was drinking Apple was drinking soy milk and rice milk. I didn't even know there was something called rice milk. And she had her on a special sleep schedule. And my child was up at all hours, and I'll never forget that.
Can you imagine comparing your mothering skills with Gwyneth Paltrow?
What was the most memorable one?
Well, one person that I love writing about was Myra Kalman. She's an illustrator and an artist, and she also writes children's books. And I was just a huge, huge fan of hers from afar. So when she illustrated this edition of Strunk & White's Elements of Style.
She did?
Yeah, that was kind of
so fun.
Yeah, that she was behind that project. And I got to go to her apartment, which is full of all these amazing artifacts. And I heard so much about her life, and I just loved her spirit. And that's sort of what I love about doing what I'm doing, which is getting to meet people you really admire and getting to know them maybe on a personal level, and then getting to write about them. I wouldn't say you become friends with any of these people necessarily, but it's nice to know that you made a connection with them and maybe introduce their work to other people.
For those aspiring editors and writers. So how much time should I allot before I can get to that point where I can meet these celebrities?
I don't know. I would say the magazine industry is not what it used to be. It's really fallen apart in the last few years. And now if I meet young people who want to go into magazine, I usually try to dissuade them from doing it. It's not.
Well, do you actually meet people who want to go into magazines?
Hardly. It's lost a lot of its luster. So now I'm a freelance writer. I don't work on staff anywhere. And I focus mostly now on design. I write about art a bit. I write a lot about food. I do some travel writing. It's sort of what suits my life now.
So let's talk about your path. How did you end up doing what you're doing?
So I probably took the most direct and straightforward path of pretty much any photographer you will encounter. I majored in photography. I graduated, and then I went the whole slogging assistant to all these photographers. And like Catherine, when I first got out of college, I worked a lot in the fashion industry. I assisted a lot of fashion photographers because that's what I was really interested in. I think, it was the height of all the supermodels, and there was so much money, and it was super creative too. And there was just so much that seemed so interesting. And I did that for ages until I ended up, transitioning into shooting on my own, which took a number of years because it's, when you're assisting, it's really hard to have your own style and your own outlook on what your work should look like, your personal work. So, because you're seeing imagery and helping people make their vision pretty much every day. So I took some time off where I stopped assisting, and I was a color printer for a while. I have a friend who is a still life photographer, Carlton Davis, and his printer left. And so I took over his printing jobs.
And this is when everything was analog.
Yeah. So I'd go into the darkroom and I'd get the negs and I would print. And so that got me away from being in the photo studio environment so that it became much more solitary, which means that I could work on my own and not be influenced by so many different outside ideas.
Can you actually make a living doing that kind of stuff?
I think you could have at one point. Clearly, a lot has changed.
Right.
So everything has gone digital.
Right.
I think a lot of the print houses and the labs pretty much closed down. So that is not something I would recommend anyone get into these days. But that enabled me to transition into shooting my own work.
So name some of the people that you've shot that's particularly memorable or interesting. Or...
So maybe this is what happens when you get older. I started out shooting a lot of celebrities. And I photographed, like John Lithgow, Adrian Brody, Michael Pitt, Maggie Gyllenhaal, James Spader, all these celebrities. But the celebrity culture started changing where you couldn't really get the same kind of relaxed access. Like everyone wanted to shoot in hotels or they wanted to shoot somewhere that wasn't their home. And it became like less and less personal. And my whole style and what I do is very personal. And it just became less interesting. And it's especially really hard to photograph people when they're wearing borrowed clothes because they're sponsored or they want to promote a label. So it's not even their clothes. And you're in some innocuous hotel room and you're trying to get intimate pictures. So at one point, I decided that I didn't want to shoot celebrities anymore, that I really just wanted to shoot real people. And that was much more interesting. So that's where the people in arts and culture, designers, writers, architects, but also it's really interesting when you shoot like what they call real people. And these are people who have somehow like broken through the news barrier, doing something interesting or culturally that, and so those stories are always really fun.
So it's kind of switching subjects here, but now here you are, doing podcasts for Korean American Story.
I know. I do think that there's a Korean kind of monoculture that I always felt that I didn't belong to and I couldn't see myself partaking in. And it's this like high achievement. There's a lot of status and a lot of people at my mom's Korean church, were like that. Or I remember my mom tried to set me up with this NYU film student as a date when I was in my 20s. And the guy wanted to see my resume before we met. And so it was I just didn't feel as a creative person who was one of the few people that my parents knew who went to art school from my generation, that there were people that I could connect with. And so when I met you and your community, it was really interesting because it felt so much more diverse. And I could see a commonality and that we could have a conversation. And even if we were different, that we could share things. And that was the first time I think I saw myself thinking I could participate in a Korean American community and not feel like I was compromising who I was and just feeling kind of awkward.
Yeah. I mean, I also avoided joining any kind of Korean social club. There are all these things at colleges, Korean club. And even in my high school, there was a Korean American or I think Asian American club. I've always had very good Korean friends and Chinese American friends, but I hate that idea of a group or an organization. And the other day, I was listening to David Chang's podcast, and he told this very funny story about the first time he went to the White House where he was invited because I think the Korean president was there or something like that. And he confessed that He has always had a great anxiety entering a room full of Korean people, and how he doesn't mind Koreans one-on-one, but he sees a room full of them and he starts to sweat. And I listened to that. I thought, that is exactly how I feel. I like Juliana, one of my dearest friends. I have lots of Asian friends, but like once I'm in a room full of Koreans, I feel suddenly uncomfortable, incredibly uncomfortable, and like a fraud, maybe not good enough or Korean enough, or I feel too generic. I don't know what it is. But in the past year or so, working on this podcast, my attitude and my anxiety has decreased. And I think I've kind of come to be more comfortable being in an officially Korean American society.
Yeah, when I first asked you about hosting this podcast with me,
I said, no way.
You're like,
I'm not
what?
comfortable. I'm not comfortable with that.
I'm a fraud.
Although I am, I'm interested in these issues. But yeah, it took me a little while to feel
I know,
like I could
after-
associate with an organization.
Yeah,
that
after a
identified
few
that way.
conversations, I remember you saying, I think I could see this happening. I think, and I was like, what are you talking about? Of course you can do it. Of course. But I think you needed to see your way into it.
Well, HJ is very welcoming. His attitude is not like one from our parents' generation, certainly. And he's very open. And I felt comfortable, actually. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's because from the very beginning, our mission has been one of inclusivity, and it's explicitly stated in our mission statement. Part of it is just practicality. 150,000 adoptees, right? What are you going to do? Like ignore them? 25% of our population, multiracial people. These are, there's going to be such amazing stories. I know people who, whose parents practically disowned them when they married outside of their race, but this was, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But now, it's become.
I think what I like about this organization is I don't get that sense that you join it and you're like, rah, rah, Koreans number one. That's why. I like an organization happy to, like an ethnic group that is happy to make fun of themselves, like the way that a good comedian will do, make fun of their own. I like that kind of humor.
It's great to hear you guys say that because our goal is to be an inclusive organization that welcomes, and at the same time, we need to be critical of our own communities, right? Just because it's been a certain way for a long time, it doesn't mean it's the way it should be.
Yeah. Well, I keep saying that to Catherine, and my Korean isn't that great, but I can understand enough and I can get by with enough vocabulary. But when I speak with Catherine and we are at certain Korean events and the person will all of a sudden say something in Korean and you'll say, what was that? And it makes me realize that from a different person's perspective that doesn't speak the language, that it can shut you out of so much stuff, So one thing I would like to say is, even though I had no idea what this was going to be like, and I know everyone hates the sound of their voice, and I do too, but it's been really, really wonderful to meet these people and interview them and get to know them. We have a specific angle, which is family-based, it's personal history-based, that we end up hearing a different side of some of these people that we've interviewed that I don't think that you get in other interviews.
I agree. Yeah.
And I've been so incredibly thankful how open and honest so many of the people we've interviewed have been. So if you have anyone that you'd like to see as a guest on K-Pod, please email us. We're open to recommendations and always looking for new people. So our email address is k-pod@koreanamericanstory.org.
And we've just launched an Instagram dedicated to our podcast. It's at KPodPod, KPODPOD. And please follow us. Thanks for listening. K-Pod is a production of KoreanAmericanStory.org. Our editor is AJ Valente, and our executive producer is HJ Lee. You can email us with comments and suggestions at kpod@KoreanAmericanStory.org.
You can see my portraits of all our podcast guests at KoreanAmericanStory.org. For news and updates on K-Pod, follow Korean American Story on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.